Well, I was a little concerned that the last two pictures I had made had not been financially successful. I've been in and out of the studio system my whole career. I was looking to make a big studio picture that had commercial possibilities, and basically reading material that I could do and also could, give me a commercial success that means that I could go on to make some movies that were closer to what I wanted to do. And I got this script from Paramount, David Mamet's script, The Untouchables, and I liked it quite a lot. And they flew me out to have a meeting with Ned Tannen about doing the project. And I remember very distinctly walking down that corridor into Ned's office with Art Linson, who I met for the first time, sitting down and discussing how we were going to do The Untouchables.
The main guy at Paramount at the time was Ned Tannen. And basically what he did is he called me and said, look, Art, come over here and produce movies. And there was two movies that I started developing. One became Scrooged, which was the comedy with Bill Murray. And the other was The Untouchables. And The Untouchables was one of those perfect situations that you can sell a studio. They owned the television rights to The Untouchables, to the name, to the television series. I was never a fan of the series, personally, but I love the folklore of the idea of Al Capone, Eliot Ness, gangland drama in Chicago. So I went to Ned Tannen and said, we should develop it. He goes, great, let's develop it. Dawn Steele was working for him, and she was very supportive of it. And we started selecting writers, and one of the few writers that came to mind was David Mamet. The idea that we had initially, at least that I wanted to pursue, which was to take it out from under the television series and turn it into a motion picture, which meant that there shouldn't be much allegiance to it. And of course, David Mamet was the perfect guy to do that. And even though I had never met David at the time, it was instant, like, let's go.
No, I didn't really care much about the television series. I'd never seen it. When I was growing up, I looked at a few episodes. I think the first episode, I sort of watched it, and it didn't have any real relationship to the script in terms of how they were going to reimagine these legendary characters.
I talked to Kevin Costner about this before the script was done, before Brian De Palma was aboard, before Ned Tannen ever read. I saw him in this movie Silverado, and I said, this guy would be a great Eliot Ness. And I got his agent to get me a breakfast meeting. He walked in, and I went, boy, this guy, perfect Eliot Ness. I explained the whole thing to him, and he goes, I don't really think it's anything that would interest me. And that was sort of the end of our conversation. I said, well, look, when this script gets done, you should look at it. And I think his agents had a lot to do with saying, look, trust me, you should do this.
Well, it was a long search. We talked to a lot of, name actors like Mel Gibson, who was interested, but then took another job at Warner Brothers, so it conflicted with our shooting schedule. And then we sort of examined sort of the young leading men of the day. And the studio basically said, you can cast it with anybody you want. I mean, this does not require stars. And we kind of settled on Kevin. I must say I was the most reluctant one because I was going to try to pull this epic gangster confrontation off with a completely unknown actor at the time, except for a few pictures he had done with Larry Kasdan. But Art felt very strongly about it. So I examined all of Kevin's work, and I talked to all the directors that had worked with him. I talked to Kasdan, I talked to Spielberg. He had done a television show for Spielberg. And every one of them said, this guy has got it. He's going to be something. And I basically relied on the advice of my contemporaries and just sort of rolled the dice. I remember sitting on a couch. He's a very straightforward, honest guy. And I was quite affected by his sincerity, which of course is essential to the part of Eliot Ness.
This set of Untouchables is for, unlike the original where there was a lot more, but they all represent the personalities that we have in a sense. I think, Sean Connery is kind of our spiritual leader in a sense, our experience, and he plays a a cop that's been on the force for a good amount of his life, and he brings all his experience to bear, especially to me. And the other two guys are Andy Garcia and Charlie Martin Smith. Andy being kind of our hothead, our kind of great shot, and Charlie being our accountant, who is really the most unlikely of the Untouchables. And then I represent kind of the thread that, you know, brings them all together. I call myself a idiot, or I say, hey idiot, I mean Eliot. So I'm really the original stiff of the group. You know, I'm Eliot Ness.
Well, I always loved the idea of Charlie Martin Smith. I've been following this actor since American Graffiti, and he's got a lot of sort of nebbish charm to him. So he was right on our list right from the beginning.
I was working on this other movie in North Carolina, and sort of out of the blue, I heard that this was happening, and they were sending a script, and I said, well, I don't really have time to read the script. But anyway, they sent the script to me, and I read it, and just really liked the story. It was I guess it's a combination of the script and the dialogue and the whole feel of it, and the idea of doing a 30s picture that really appealed to me. Also, I wanted to work with Brian because I had met him before, but we never had a chance to work together. I play Oscar Wallace. Actually, Wallace is based on a true character, on a man named Frank Wilson, who was the guy that really did most of the work to put Capone away. For everything that Capone did, he was ultimately caught on tax evasion. So that's what Wallace represents, is Wallace is an accountant who has this idea. The reason, of course, that we're called the Untouchables is that we can't be bribed. We can't be touched. And there's a wonderful scene, I think, in the picture where the alderman comes and attempts to bribe Ness and his men, and we turn him down. And that's how the name comes.
Brian and I talked about Andy Garcia because he was the villain in a movie called 8 Million Ways to Die for Hal Ashby. And he was this wonderful villain in the picture. And we said, God, this guy would be a perfect Nitty.
Andy came in to read for Nitty and convinced us to let him read for the part of George Stone. We had sort of imagined him as a heavy, but he wanted to try for this other part, and he read it and was quite amazing. And Art and I were immediately taken by him.
No, I was very attracted to the whole period, you know. I mean, it's such a great, kind of colorful, rich period of time. One of my ambitions was to work in this kind of period-type film, which I hadn't had a chance to do, and to ride a horse. And I got to do both, surprisingly. I never knew the Untouchables were going to be on a horse, but it was terrific.
I knew Sean, and I felt this was the only guy that could do the part, and we were able to get him to read the script. And I, again, remember meeting him in LA and talking about the part. And he kind of liked the idea of it. And Sean is, again, a very straight, tough guy. You just have to tell him exactly what you want. He's there, he does it, but don't give him any kind of gray areas. So he and I got along very well.
Well, I think everybody in the world knows about the Untouchables, actually. You know, it's been with us about 30 years on television, and the moment I knew that it was written by Mamet, I was more than interested. And I thought it was a very clever concept to take the old cop who was not too happy with the status quo in Chicago and use him as this kind of old dog that teaches a new dog the tricks and how to deal with the situation in the Chicago way, as it were. Brian wanted me to be the older guy that takes them all by the neck, as it were, and is kind of like a school teacher, sort of father figure type, you know, which is kind of easy for me, you know, and fun, because I enjoy working, especially with good actors, and they're all good actors, so there's no problems. And certainly no problems in terms of temperament, dispositions, or egos or whatever, nothing that couldn't be resolved with humor. You know, and it certainly paid off in the picture because I liked them all. You know, I think it's very mutual and worked with that sort of goal in mind.
I think what's interesting is that the four of us are quite different the same way the four Untouchables are different. I think probably it's very good casting in that when Brian put the four of us together, he was looking for four very different guys who are brought together. Normally they would have nothing in common, but this one thing is what brings them together. I think that makes a very good drama. But I'm just having a terrific time with all of them. Sean is a very European actor, as he's doesn't obviously come from the American method school. You know, Andy is a guy who really comes at it with a sort of passion, and everything comes out of his gut, which is very different from the way that Sean works. And I probably am more technical than that as an actor. It's just interesting to see the way we all approach everything differently. We all approach every scene differently, the same way the four Untouchables, I suppose, approach things.
I think we're all basically loners. I mean, we didn't really hang together a lot off the set, although if anybody needed anything, somebody was right there. But they're all strong. If you meet any one of these guys, it's very clear that each one knows their own personality. So to work with them, they're all gentlemen, they're all very good actors, and they all fit this movie very well. You know, they really were the best ones for the parts.
And then, of course, we got to the Capone casting. The problem with Capone was, again, we were in great sort of budget problems. Again, the studio said, you don't need stars for this film. So I had seen Bob Hoskins, and I felt, this guy's, he's obviously a great actor. Of course, he isn't an American gangster, but he does an American accent very well. So we, in fact, went out for Bob Hoskins and managed to make a deal with him. At the same time, I kept on pushing to use Bob De Niro because of my long relationship with him. And Art said, go try and get him. So I spent, weeks and weeks meeting with Bob, talking about the part. And finally, I got him to say, yeah, he had a kind of a tight schedule where he could fit it in. It was only really shot for a little over 2 weeks. So I managed to finally convince him to see how he could work it into his schedule. And he said, yeah, I think I can do this. And then he said he wanted a huge amount of money for 2 weeks. Of course, the studio was in shock, and Ned Tannen said, forget it, it's over. We're going with Bob Hoskins. We hired him. Don't talk to me about Bob De Niro. And Art and I went, oh boy, now we're really going to have a battle of the budget. Meanwhile, I felt very strongly that we needed a major mafia gangster movie star to play Al Capone, and Bob De Niro was the perfect guy. And here I was in a budget meeting, and at the end of the meeting, I looked at Art and all the other executives and Ned in the room, and I said, would you please excuse us? And Art was sort of like in shock.
Brian made one of the more courageous moves I've seen a director make in Hollywood when it comes to the machinations of how the game works. Brian turned and said, look, I've got some really bad news. Not only can I not take the movie down by $1 million, I'm not prepared to make the movie with Bob Hoskins because I want to make it with Bob De Niro. And so not only are we not going to take the budget down, the budget's going to go up, or I'm not prepared to make the movie.
To his credit, Ned sort of nodded and said, get me his agent's phone number. Let me see what I can do. And Ned made it happen, which included paying off Bob Hoskins.
It was a great chess move on Brian's part. And quite frankly, Bob was sublime as Al Capone. Simple as that. Every frame that Bob is in is kind of priceless. So, it was one of the best moves we made on the movie. After all of the war and fight that Brian and I went through just to get Bob in this movie and all the costs and expense and everything, when he finally showed up in Chicago, he was pencil thin, very quiet, soft-spoken, and we had a brief meeting. Everything went as one would expect. But I do remember calling Brian and, half hour after the meeting was over going, are you sure that was Bob De Niro? Because, if it's not really Bob De Niro, we're fucked, because this guy is no more going to scare two pussycats on a street than he is going to be Al Capone. He goes, don't worry, when he comes back in 3 months, because we're going to shoot him at the end of the schedule, you're going to see that he's going to easily play it. And sure enough, of course, Bob totally transformed himself. And suddenly the grin, the menace, the hair, the whole thing was right in place. And it was kind of a thrill to watch him.
He didn't have time to really put on the weight that he wanted to put on because he was, shooting, I think, pictures on either side of ours. So we worked out a kind of bodysuit for him. But he had to put enough weight on for his face to get that round look. And, of course, shave back his hair at the top to give the bald Capone look. And he had these excellent makeup people he had used on Once Upon a Time in America that did a fantastic job with the hair pieces and the scar and all the other things that make Al Capone Al Capone. Well, the interesting thing about De Niro I discovered in this film after working with him for many years early in his career is that he was doing things so subtly I could not see them while I was shooting. I could only see them on the screen. It's kind of a strange idea, but if you stand behind a camera and you look at me while I'm talking, you're, pretty far away from me. And unless you have a pair of binoculars, you're not going to see what I look like on the screen, which is shooting a close-up. And with De Niro, I could not see what he was doing. I would sort of look at another take and I'd say, did he do anything different than the take before? Or I'd walk up to him and he'd sort of look at me and say, don't worry about it, it's going to be okay. That's what I discovered, that this guy knows how to act in such a way so subtly that you can't see it while you're shooting it.
He's one of our best actors, I could say the same for Sean Connery. I think that both those guys give our film so much weight and so much integrity to begin with. As an actor, there's a lot to be learned from them. The trick is to not get involved with how great they are. The trick is to be prepared yourself so that you can give to them as an actor, because they're going to be giving back to you.
This movie was much like, Carrie and Scarface, in the sense that we use people no one had ever seen before, or had only done a few films that nobody knew about. And the film was a hit, and their performances launched them on careers. And in The Untouchables, when you look at it now, you say, God, what a star-studded cast. Well, the only star on The Untouchables was Sean Connery and Bob De Niro when we started. My image of The Untouchables is that corruption looks great. It's like Nazi Germany. It's clean, it's big, everything runs smoothly. The problem is all the oppressed people are in some camp somewhere and nobody ever sees them. So the world of Chicago is a slick world, a world that's run by money and corruption. And it looks fabulous.
The Untouchables was the second picture I did with Brian. I read the script, and then I came over here to Paramount, and I had a meeting with him. So I was very excited to do the picture. And so, as you do with any director, before I went in and talked to Brian, I kind of researched the period. And of course, I wanted to do it in black and white. And when I met with Art and Brian and Patricia von Brandenstein, who was the production designer, Brian says, what's your idea? And I said, I'd like to do it in black and white. And he said, don't break your heart, Steve. He said, they're not going to let us do it. Come up with another idea. So I brought in these books, and I showed him these black and white pictures that had a stylistic situation where you had a lot of repetitive manufactured images. And I said to him, let's do a compositional plan where we have a series of these repetitive images. I knew we were going to have a lot of cars in the picture. So I said, we can get all the same kind of car and we can just line them up and kind of have something that's evocative of that period. And the other thing we should do is we should do something that gives us a feeling of more space, because there weren't as many people in 1930 and the Depression was just starting in the United States and not a lot of people around. So notice, in the picture, when you do a close-up or a two-shot, there's a lot of negative space on the sides, and that is to represent that feeling of things aren't as crowded as they are now. And so that was kind of my basic situation, and that was the basic plan for the picture.
De Palma is, I think, a marvelous choice, and I really think it's got, really good epic proportions, because they're shooting in CinemaScope, which was his choice anyway, and to try and recreate 1930s. For example, where we are in this building now, there are many buildings like this here. We took over a building called the State of Illinois, I think it was called, where we turned it all over into the police department, a whole floor there. And it's very authentic. It's very much like that. You can't build these things.
Eric Schwab had been my location scout for many years, starting with Body Double. And I sent him into Chicago way early in the pre-production part of the movie to find the locations we could use, because it's period and it's difficult to shoot in a modern American city because all the sort of period buildings have modern buildings in front of them, and we had to be very careful about what parts of Chicago we shot.
Very, very difficult on the exteriors. When we were shooting in front of the Wrigley building where that bridge goes across the river, behind that are these great big modern skyscrapers. And at night, all the lights are on because the people are cleaning them. So the production department was able to arrange for all those lights to be turned off so the buildings would just go black. The funny thing is that every once in a while, all of a sudden, you just see a big line of light come on because the people who were cleaning, the janitors, would just turn them on. So luckily, it never ruined any takes.
There is so much to choose from in this city, and I think we had very good luck, but I also think we chose well. We had a physical reality of the Sullivan's Auditorium Hotel, which is now Roosevelt University. We have excellent pictures of life in the Lexington Hotel. And we know that Capone's men played games in the lobby. We know that there was a lot of loose living on those floors. We know there were wicked ladies, and we know that there was a lot of gambling and so forth and so on. I do love Capone's suite because it has such a luridly extravagant quality, and it was immense fun to plan out and do. Although, to recreate domestic life and the domestic interiors of our other characters, I very much liked Officer Malone's house, which was a practical location, but it was altered very extensively. It was a complete redress, including putting in bath and kitchen and so forth and so on. And I think that it worked very, very well.
Patrizia, of course, had scouted a lot of locations. We went out and we looked at all these locations. And during the time we looked at all this stuff, we talk about where the light is, you know, what the access is to all of these things, how we're going to work everything, and which things were going to be practical locations, which things were going to be built in the studio. Originally, the courtroom was going to be a practical location in the library building, the same place where we did the chase on the roof. But there was some sort of situation, so the whole courtroom set was built.
As far as the vintage automobiles, there are literally hundreds used on this film. Police cars and delivery trucks, and a snowplow, which figures prominently in the action, limousines, personal cars for major characters, taxis, milk trucks and bread vans, all manner of them gathered together. Some of them doubled, some of them 2 or 3 times doubled, all gathered together for the film.
Well, when you start a picture, you get together with the production designer and the costume people come in, and there's just like a general discussion. And everybody has done exactly what I did, is that they will research the period and they will have some ideas that they want to bring forward. My conversations with Marilyn Vance were mainly on the colors and the textures of the clothes. And clothing in those days, the film wasn't as good as it is now, so you had a lot of trouble reading detail in blacks. So what you did was you always would ask the costume designer to have texture in a dark color, so you could cross-light that texture and it would show up, and so it wouldn't be completely lost. Because in those days, a lot of people wore those hats. We wanted hats that looked like the hats of the period, but the brims weren't so big that, you know, that their eyes were always covered up. So there was a little modification as far as Eliot Ness's hat goes, the kind of hat that Sean's character was going to wear.
So I was trying to think, how could I get, you know, something, a new kind of look at this kind of, you know, 30s suit gangster thing. And Dawn Steele came up with the idea of using Giorgio Armani. She had worked for Giorgio and knew him quite well, and said, why don't we get Giorgio to do all this? And I said, fabulous. So Giorgio came in and designed clothes for everyone, and everyone wore them except for Sean, who said, this is ridiculous, I can't wear this stuff, and sort of came up with his own outfit. The art director and I decided that we should make Al Capone like Louis XIV. He's the Sun King. And that's why she designed this set that has this sort of sun on the floor that I designed the shot of, so we can see the Sun King in his environment, everybody waiting for him to burp or sit while he goes to the bathroom, he's the king. So everybody sort of sits in waiting. So I kind of got this idea that, he's being shaved and everybody's sort of waiting while he's under the towel, while his face softens up for the razor. And we could hold the shot for a while and run some titles to set the period while Al's face is getting warmed up for a shave. And that shows true power. Everybody sits and waits for the master, the man of power, the man that runs the world, the God that's at the center of the universe. The sun rises and falls depending on when he says it's day or night. So that was the idea for the shot. And I can't tell you how many, I think 17, 18, 19, 20 takes with that crane shot dropping down, trying to get this all in one take, but I never succeeded. And we had to put a cutaway into the reporters in order to make the scene work.
Brian always had the idea that the four needed to be very distinct characters, and I really thought of Wallace as everyman. He was the average guy that never thought in a million years that he'd be chasing down Al Capone, and being given a gun and a badge and all of this, and I felt like I was kind of representing that part of the audience. So I just wanted to sort of play into that, wanted to play into that sort of frame of mind. Brian wanted me to smoke the pipe. He wanted to play into all of the amusing stuff too. And he said to me something early on, which I've never forgotten. He said, I want the audience to be laughing with your character. I want them to be laughing right up until, boom, you get it. And I thought, okay, fair enough. But Brian had very specific ideas about the fact that he wanted me to be funny. And I wasn't sure about that. I saw some of it, and I wanted to represent this average guy, but I didn't want it to cross over into buffoonery. I just didn't think that was right for the movie. But I decided early on, he's the director. He knows exactly how far this should go. So I think more than any movie I had done up until that point, I really sort of put myself in the hands of the director.
The relationship between Ness and Malone, again, was very clearly delineated in the script. And Sean and Kevin developed that relationship on and off screen. I remember Sean was always kidding Kevin about his hat, They all had these hats, and, Kevin was always very concerned about his hat. And Sean would be relentlessly kidding him about his hat all the time, and where was his hat. And I think in that very complicated Steadicam shot, when they come out of the elevator, at one point, I think Kevin forgot his hat. So the hat became kind of a running joke throughout the film between those two. And you see that kind of camaraderie between them on the screen.
Well, it's one of those classic relationships where you have experience. I think we all would like to maybe go through life with kind of a figure that's standing over us, be able to keep us from mistakes. And Sean represents that, and with all the charm that Sean brings to bear in a movie, especially this one, he's just great in this part. So it's great to have him. I don't have to think too hard. When he's around, he really is the strength of this picture. He really is our anchor.
There's a scene between Malone and Ness. He really wants to test him to see if he's going to go all the way with him. Because this is not just a simple game between cops and robbers. There are heavy dues to pay if you're going to get Al Capone. And originally the scene was set, I think, of them walking along the street. And Sean, when he read the scene, thought it might be a good idea to set it in a church because he felt that Jimmy Malone was an Irish Catholic, and if they were going to go to a place where they wouldn't have to worry about people eavesdropping on them, a church was the best place to go, because you've got to set up the idea that Chicago is owned by Al Capone. That means everybody throughout Chicago is going to overhear what they say and tell Al Capone's people, and they're going to be set up and destroyed. So he takes them to the one sacred place where he feels he's safe, and it was this fabulous church that we found in Chicago.
It was a well-written scene to begin with, and Sean's choice to put it in a church was just, again, his experience coming to bear, not only for me personally, but in this case, the film.
More than that, to talk about Mamet's dialogue, it's construction and economy, and it's quite simple, and in many instances, very biblical. And the old, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but always you give them more than they really want to deal with.
What we did was, because the church was very, very large, and we couldn't light the whole church. So what I did was that I was able to shoot a low angle, put Sean and Kevin in the foreground, and have the big arch for the church window in the back. All I did was light the ceiling and light the background and light the two guys. And I did it with a very, very wide angle lens. So I would have three planes. I had their hands in the foreground, I had the guys in the middle ground, and then I had the big vaulted ceiling in the background. Now, it made their hands look bigger. And it reminded me of the painting on the Sistine Chapel, where you have like the two hands, or you have the hand of God and man coming together and it's sparking life. And it was kind of the same thing with these two guys, as you have life being sparked into both people.
The Al Capone speeches were all written by Mamet. His sort of, being kind of the media darling of the age and giving these press conferences was very much in the David Mamet script. I love De Niro when he's ranting and raving. And of course, there's the favorite, much satirized, beating the guy to death with a baseball bat, which was based on a real incident that happened that David put in the script, and I shot in a kind of very captivating way. He's the king. He's the god. He makes people live. He makes people die.
The thing that makes Brian De Palma well known is this visual style that he has. His camera work is something that film students study because this is what he's so well known for. But I think, like all directors, Brian is a good storyteller. And even in scenes with the camera stationary, he's still telling the story. He's not just a director who moves the camera around.
So you're going to be seeing Sean.
That's why his pictures are classic pictures, and that's why his pictures are very, very well made. Very, very high level of craft, very high level of thought and care. You can go frame by frame, you can go cut by cut, and you can just see, the craftsmanship that he evokes from all the people who work for him.
You're dealing in a very kind of tired genre, gangsters. We've seen it a million times, and believe me, it's been done beautifully many times. So to try to find another way into this, and going along with the intention of the material, I came up with this kind of larger-than-life world to make it into a kind of John Ford-type drama, good against evil. And the sequence out on the bridge just sort of moved it right into John Ford territory. I felt it was very important to get out of Chicago for a little bit and inhale a lot of fresh air.
The whole Montana thing, as scripted, we were supposed to be hiding behind a rock, and we're watching for these guys to come over the bridge, and then we run across to the bridge. That's the way it was scripted. We got to Montana, we had a blocking rehearsal the day before we were supposed to start shooting. The four of us and Brian went out. We got down behind, we staged a scene behind the rock. We tried to run across this field. It was ridiculous. It was crazy. So we said, look, there's this cabin that we've built for this interrogation scene later, and we've got these horses for another scene when we first arrive. Why don't we all sit in this cabin, play that waiting stuff in the cabin, and then ride up to the bridge on horses? So that immediately, of course, made a simple scene into an extremely complex scene, which took us days and days longer to shoot. But I think it really completely makes the middle of the movie. And this business of coming out and riding on the horses, and I said to Brian, I just want to be loving every minute. I just want to be whooping it up on the way across. Here's Oscar Wallace riding this thing. I just said, I just want to let it rip. He said, go ahead. I can always cut around it if I don't like it. He was very good at sort of letting us bring to our characters what we wanted to bring.
I just think a scene like that adds a dimension to a film. It does the thing that's great about films, which is it takes you somewhere else. Suddenly we're taken out of Chicago, and we're really not taken out of the movie, but subconsciously now we're just somewhere else, and there's a different flavor. We were actually, I think, hoping for snow. We didn't know how lucky we were, because what we did get were the changing leaves, which was absolutely beautiful. But what happens is just there's another texture. I mean, the story propels itself, and the story is is good in its line. It doesn't, you realize that you're dealing with Prohibition, but suddenly we're reenacting a Canadian border raid, which is really, really great. It gives people maybe a chance to breathe, because sometimes even when you watch a city picture, you just can't breathe a little bit. And this picture, certainly allows for that, running horses, which nobody would have ever guessed, but yet it was a real tool. It was a real tool to combat things.
That was another thing I said. I just want to be screaming at these guys as I'm shooting. I just want to be yelling. I wanted this business just to be this unbelievable adrenaline rush for this accountant blasting away at people with a shotgun. At the end of that sequence, Brian said, okay, here's what I want you to do. It's going to be a couple of bullet holes in there, and there's going to be whiskey coming out of this thing. I want you to look around, sneak, and take a drink of the whiskey. I said, oh, no. I said, oh, that's a little bit too much, don't you think? I mean, that's a bit much. I don't really know if that's right. It seems too silly. He said, no, it'll be a great moment. And I really, really hesitated. I really didn't want to do it. I thought, that's just too shticky, But Brian said, no, I want them to be laughing all the way up until you die. And I said, he's the director, absolutely, I'll do it. And of course, when you see the movie, he's absolutely right. It's absolutely the right thing to do at that moment. It's a great moment. And it's all Brian. Yeah, that whole sequence of scenes leading up to my death, Brian wanted to just use the Steadicam, this handheld camera, to do one long flowing scene, almost like you would a stage play, and just keep it playing, and keep it flowing. That which is really hard to do. And it seems to me on that day we had something like an 8 o'clock call, and we got in there and started blocking. And I think we shot take 1 at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, my heavens, we just were there all day, preparing to do this.
When you use a continuous shot, sort of like a time bomb, it's ticking, something terrible is going to happen. You establish that Nitty is in the elevator, and it's just a matter of time before something terrible is going to happen.
Brian did not want to actually see Wallace get shot. He thought that would be too much for the audience to handle, and I agreed with it. But he wanted to do this thing hanging me up in the elevator on this hook. And as we were setting this up, and they started coming in and smearing me up with blood, Brian, of course, has a reputation, he certainly did then, of not going easy on the blood. So they were really laying it on. He came and said, that's too much. He said, that's too much blood. I'm thinking, this is Brian De Palma? He said, no, it was just, he was very specific about that. He didn't want it to be too gory, but it had to have that kind of impact. And I stood on a box in there, and because I couldn't actually be hung up, but I sort of did my hanging up thing. And we shot the scene where Sean comes in. And as Sean came in and saw me and looks at me and says, oh, Jesus, and then he lifts me off and puts me on the ground, I almost wept.
Brian always has 2 sequences, as he always does in a picture. He does a creeper sequence, and he does what I call the holdout sequence. Now, the creeper sequence is best identified in this picture as Sean Connery being killed. And what happens is that it's usually a camera that's point of view, that's following somebody that is trying to avoid being seen. So it's all done in a very kind of first-person, kind of subjective kind of way. But the idea of it is that you're setting up tension.
I was amazed to find out when we were putting all these hits on him, these blood things that explode because he gets, raked up and down with a machine gun, that he'd never had a hit put on him. So when we shot the scene, Sean was like appalled at what was going on. I mean, he played it out, and then he was, some dust got in his eye, and we ran him off to the hospital, and I had to beg him to come back and do that scene again, to take those hits again. He hated it. It's just everything he dislikes about movie making. He did not like it, and he had never experienced it before, and thank God I got him to do it again. We finally got another take out of him taking those bullet hits. Of course, he did it beautifully, but he was not a happy guy. Oh, I made it extremely violent. I mean, this is your lead character, going down, and it's going to motivate Ness to do things he could never imagine that he could do. So it had to be shocking.
The other sequence is the holdout sequence. And what Brian does is that he tells the audience that there's a certain task that the character has to do. And you know what that is. And you're going to expect that to go forward. But what happens is that there are impediments put in the way.
David Mamet had written in a period train sequence of crashing period trains that as much over budget as we were, this took it to a level that was beyond anything that Paramount was prepared to do. We couldn't find the period trains, and if we did, we couldn't crash them. I mean, it was just, at the time, an impossible situation.
I said, well, this scene's basically about Eliot Ness getting the accountant, and whether he chases him on a train and from a car to a train and catches him way outside of Chicago, it makes no difference. Maybe he can nail him in the train station. So I said, find me a set of steps in a train station. And of course, Chicago is one of the great train stations, great period train stations.
Unfortunately, because at that time there wasn't enough equipment in Chicago to do that, we had to bring a lot of stuff from California. If we could have done the sequence during the day, it was right over a big skylight, we could have done it with the equipment that we had. But they didn't want a bunch of gunshots at Union Station during the day with train passengers coming. So we had to do it at night.
And we shot there, I guess, for like 14, 16 nights, and I literally made the sequence up. Of course, inspired by the Potemkin sequence, remembering the baby carriage from the Odessa steps, and Ness, because his wife has just had a baby, you know, a baby represents a kind of purity, and you get the innocent in the midst of this gun battle. I took this great visual idea from Eisenstein's Potemkin with this baby carriage bouncing down the steps and stuck it right in the middle of my gangster shootout. But I literally made it up as I shot it. Needless to say, I had laid the whole movie out shot by shot, but I was like flying through this sequence, and it worked out extremely well. All those choices were sort of made right from the inception of the sequence. I had done, of course, many slow motion action sequences before. I like the stylized use of sound where you get rid of all the, real sound and use sound very specifically to point the audience's ear to specific things happening in the sequence. Of course, the great Ennio Morricone score, and he came up with the idea of this sort of children's box, which completely surprised me, and he said, let me make this work. Believe me, I can make this work. And I said, okay. This isn't exactly what I had in mind, but of course he did make it work. So it's a combination of many great ideas and artists at work to come up with the sequence, which is quite moving.
Billy Drago, I thought, just did a terrific job as Frank Nitti. He, in the white suit and everything. Billy Drago is a wonderful actor and the nicest guy, but there's a formidable kind of otherworldly thing about the way he looks. And his kind of intensity, I think, in the part of Nitti means that he's a real important screen presence, even when he's not talking. The scenes when he doesn't really have dialogue, he's almost like an extra in the scene, and it's only later on that he becomes the important figure that he is in the movie.
He's like the white serpent. He's a bad guy. And he doesn't have a lot of scenes in terms of establishing his character. He's just like Al Capone's evil enforcer. So we put him in a white suit to make sure that he stood out when you see him in the background, because this guy is going to become very important. So your eye is really drawn to this white suit, white hat that he wears. Very stylized, beautiful design of his look by Armani. And of course it gets worse and worse until, of course, Eliot Ness finally throws him off the roof. And we took quite a lot of shots to get because blue screens, fallings were, not too sophisticated at that time, and we had to do it many times to get it effective.
That stunt of him going off the roof is for the audience to savor the bad guy being killed. Then, of course, the down shot is part of that repetitive manufacturing pattern. And we didn't have him land in the middle, had him land out to the edge. So your eye scan would have to scan all the way along there because, you want enough time for people to take in the whole scene and have the eye scan point to him in the last situation.
And of course, then we had this big scuffle about to happen with Al being pulled back by his bodyguards. And then, of course, this beautiful exchanging of the chain between Ness and Stone, the symbol that was established early when the group of them were together and immortalized in a photograph that was taken.
I remember a scene that we shot and we aborted. There was an ending for the picture where it bookends the whole movie. And what it does, you start close on Capone. He's being shaved again. He's in a barber's chair. And as we pull up, you see that he has reporters around him, but he's in his jail cell. And we started, and I think that the dialogue was new, or there was something that wasn't quite right about it. So we did a couple of takes, and Brian said, let's not do this today, and we just quit. And I asked him, I said, do you want me to hold the setup, and we can come back Monday, and maybe he can think about it on, over Sunday. He goes, no, he says, it's not right, it's not going to work. And that was the end of that.
Last shot in the film was the newspaper coming off the truck, and the guy coming in from a hotel, picking it up and taking it inside. It was just starting to get cold. I remember extremely well, because after that shot, I got in a plane and went to the airport and went home.